January 1944. Somewhere along a frozen road outside Leningrad, the world feels made of iron and mud. The forest breathes frost. Snowdrifts settle over broken fences, twisted telegraph poles, and the silent shells of burnt-out trucks. Out of the gray haze comes a sound that once meant invincibility. The deep, grinding growl of a Tiger WWII. 45 tons of armor and arrogance, crawling forward through ruts carved by 100 retreats. Its broad tracks crush the frozen soil, clinking with rhythm, the smell of oil and exhaust mingling with pine smoke. A few meters ahead, crouched in a shallow ditch, a lone engineer works with trembling hands. No explosives, no anti-tank gun, only a spool of wire. Dull, steel gray, pulled taut across the road like a hunter's snare. He knows what one jam track can do to a column. One stall, and the monster behind becomes a target. He pulls the line tight, anchors it, and waits. The roar grows closer. The moment of contact is seconds away. By early 1944, the Tiger WWII was already legend, a weapon wrapped in fear, myth, and cold mechanical brilliance. Germany's answer to the Red Army's swelling armor divisions, it had rolled onto the battlefields of Kursk, Tunisia, and Normandy like a moving fortress. Each Tiger weighed nearly 57 tons, protected by up to 100 millimeters of frontal armor, impervious to most Allied guns of the time. Its 88mm KK-36 cannon could destroy a Sherman or T-34 from over 2 kilometers away. Soldiers on both sides spoke of the Tiger in hushed tones, as if it were alive, a predator of steel that hunted with sound before sight. But beneath that myth lay something more fragile: complexity. The Tiger was a masterpiece of over-engineering, powerful but temperamental. Its Maybach HL-230 engine strained to move its massive bulk. Transmissions broke under pressure. The wide tracks that gave it traction in mud also made it vulnerable to jamming and derailment. In freezing mud or soft thaw, even a misplaced stone could twist a link and halt it cold. German mechanics knew this well. Every kilometer of movement was a victory against friction. Tanks that survived combat often fell victim to mud, snow, or the sheer stress of their own weight. One Tiger needed hours of maintenance for every few hours of operation, and every breakdown turned into a tactical liability. That was the hidden truth of German heavy armor. What protected it from shells also enslaved it to terrain. Meanwhile, on the other side of the front, Soviet and Allied engineers had learned that brute strength wasn't the only answer to the Tiger. You didn't need to pierce its armor. You only needed to stop. It, reports from the Eastern Front, described teams of sappers and infantry crawling close to immobilized tanks, using crowbars, chains, and even spare track pins to jam sprockets or break links. In some desperate moments, thin steel wire, the kind used for telegraph lines or field communications, became an impromptu tool of sabotage. It was everywhere. Every communications reel carried hundreds of meters of flexible steel wire, capable of pulling tight around machinery or entangling exposed drive wheels. To a resourceful engineer, it wasn't just a means of sending messages, it was a weapon of opportunity. In the winter of 1944, as German armor columns advanced through villages and frozen roads, supply lines were stretched thin, and engineers worked with what they had. Field manuals taught how to set mines and obstacles, but in practice, improvisation was survival. The Tiger's wide front sprockets and interleaved road wheels left only narrow gaps for mud to escape, and anything that entered those channels risked wedging deep. A length of wire looped around a turning sprocket could tighten instantly, cutting into the track or locking the mechanism. It wasn't guaranteed. It wasn't even standard doctrine, but it was possible. The engineer crouched by the road might have been one of thousands, Soviet, Polish, or even Allied, trained not just to destroy, but to delay. For every Tiger that burned, many more were stranded, abandoned, or captured after immobilization. In the calculus of war, motion meant life. Stillness meant death. And so the greatest tank of its era faced its most dangerous enemy: not always another machine, but the ingenuity of a man with nothing but a wire reel and seconds to act. Because in the frozen fields of Europe, even a giant could fall silent if the right part stopped moving. The Tiger was never meant for the kind of war it found itself fighting by 1944. When it first appeared in 1942 near Leningrad, it embodied German confidence. The idea that superior technology could dominate any battlefield. Yet by 1944, that confidence was eroding under the weight of reality. The Eastern Front had become a sea of mud, snow, and attrition. Fuel was scarce. Spare parts scarcer still. Every kilometer east or west was fought over with desperation. And the German Armored Corps, once the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, had become a chain of steel beasts constantly breaking down and needing rescue. Field workshops were overwhelmed. The Tiger's complex overlapping wheel system, designed for smooth travel on roads, clogged with mud and froze solid overnight. Crews had to use blowtorches or small fires under the hull to thaw the tracks before dawn. And if the tracks threw even a single link, recovery required cranes or other tanks to tow the immobilized hulk. In this environment, engineers and sappers became more dangerous than any artillery battery. They learned that immobilizing a tank didn't require firepower, only timing and courage. On narrow forest roads, a single halted Tiger could block an entire column. In urban or forested terrain, that meant ambush opportunities, where infantry with grenades or Molotovs could finish what engineering ingenuity had begun. This was particularly true on the Leningrad and Kursk fronts, where the terrain funneled tanks into predictable routes. Bridges, choke points, and muddy causeways. Sappers would hide in drainage ditches or behind collapsed barns, setting improvised snares or deploying mines disguised under straw and snow. Sometimes these were crude, nails welded to plates, frozen logs laid across trenches. Sometimes they were cunningly simple, tensioned steel wires designed to catch in motion. The wire wasn't expected to cut through metal. It only needed to tangle. A loop under tension, once caught in a spinning sprocket, could tighten rapidly and cause a sudden jam. The Tiger's heavy torque could amplify that tension, pulling the wire deeper until it snapped a pin or misaligned the drive teeth. In the chaos of combat, even a temporary stall could doom the crew. German after-action reports tell of immobilizations blamed on foreign objects in the tracks or drive assemblies, wire, cord, twisted metal, even remnants of fencing pulled up by the tracks. While not all were deliberate traps, they showed how the Tiger's power could be turned against itself. The same physics that gave it strength made it fragile to disruption. To the men facing these tanks, this wasn't theory, it was survival. Combat engineers were trained to think laterally. Manuals from both Allied and Soviet sources encouraged using local materials to hinder enemy armor when mines or explosives ran out. Bridges could be weakened, mud pits widened, and obstacles seeded with wire or cable. In that world, a simple spool of field wire issued to nearly every engineer and communication unit became a tool of countless improvisations. It was strong enough to anchor, flexible enough to weave, and expendable enough to risk. Even German engineers faced the same reality. In Italy and Normandy, they too used communication wire to trigger charges, tie camouflage nets, or create trip snares against advancing Shermans. The material was universal. By 1944, across every front, the war of machines had evolved into a war of adaptation. Every advance in armor produced a countermeasure. Every countermeasure inspired a new design. And amid that cycle, one truth remained. In war, simplicity often defeats sophistication. Somewhere in that frozen silence, whether near Leningrad, Kursk, or the Ardennes, an unnamed engineer pulled a length of wire taut across a rutted road, hoping it would catch. It was not strategy. It was instinct, and that instinct, quiet, desperate, ingenious, would soon meet the roar of the Tiger. The human angle, fear, focus, and fragile courage. Every great war invention begins not in laboratories, but in fear. For combat engineers on the Eastern Front, Fear was the air they breathed. Their task was brutal: move forward before the tanks, clear mines under fire, or hold the rear when retreating. They didn't fight glory's battles. They built, dismantled, and survived. An engineer crouching in a ditch with a spool of wire didn't see himself as a hero. He was a problem solver in chaos. Behind the Tiger's thunderous echo lay the understanding that machines could fail, and that gave him hope. The sound of treads was a countdown. Every heartbeat matched each metallic clank. In war, courage rarely looked cinematic. It looked like stillness, holding one's breath while a tank passed meters away, waiting for the exact moment to pull a wire tight. The mind raced through physics and chance. The angle of the track, the weight of mud, the wire's tensile strength. This was human ingenuity stripped to its essence. Survival through intellect. The wire wasn't a weapon of destruction, but defiance. The tactical angle. Immobilization as victory. In the doctrine of armored warfare, destruction isn't always necessary. Immobilization can be equally decisive. A moving tiger is a predator. A stationary tiger is a target. For Allied and Soviet tacticians, the goal was not always to destroy German armor outright. It was to stall it long enough for artillery or infantry to strike. In forested terrain or narrow roads, even one disabled tank could choke an entire formation. The Tiger's enormous width and slow turning radius made it especially vulnerable in such confined environments. This tactical logic shaped countless field operations. Engineers were tasked not with killing tanks, but with stopping them. Every immobilized Tiger delayed fuel convoys, blocked reinforcements, and created chaos in communication lines. That's why simple obstacles, logs, cables, or wires had strategic value far beyond their simplicity. They were tools to control space and time. When one tank halted, every vehicle behind it became exposed. A single breakdown could collapse an entire push, and in an age when German supply chains were already stretched, time was as lethal as artillery. The wire loop, if successful, was not a miracle. It was a weapon of delay. And delay in 1944 could mean defeat. The technological angle. The Tiger's strength as its weakness. The Tiger, I was an engineering marvel, but its complexity was a double-edged sword. Its interleaved road wheels, overlapping in 3 layers, gave exceptional traction and stability, but they also trapped mud, stones, and snow. In freezing temperatures, the packed debris solidified, causing immense strain on the suspension. The drive sprocket at the front was the heart of motion, a large, toothed wheel that pulled the track forward. It was also one of the tank's most vulnerable external points. If a wire or cable were caught between its teeth and the steel track, the rotational torque could cinch the wire instantly, locking the mechanism. Even a momentary jam could throw the track or shear off a pin. German mechanics recorded dozens of instances where foreign material, fencing, barbed wire, or wreckage, jammed sprockets or derailed tracks. In controlled conditions, this could be cleared quickly. But under combat pressure amid shellfire and panic, an immobilized Tiger was a death sentence. Its own design, made to dominate open fields, turned fragile in improvised battlefields, forests, towns, and frozen swamps. The heavier it was, the easier it was to trap. So the wire loop wasn't a miracle invention. It was a mechanical inevitability waiting to be noticed. The enemy's angle, inside the Tiger, from inside the Tiger, the world looked claustrophobic and loud. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and metal. When a track jammed, the entire machine groaned, a violent shudder reverberating through the steel hull. The driver's instruments spiked. The commander's orders came fast. Standard procedure in the Wehrmacht manuals instructed immediate halt if resistance was felt in the drive sprocket, to prevent further damage. Crews would often open hatches and inspect, unaware that stopping made them visible targets. Imagine that moment. 57 tons of power suddenly motionless, the crew confused, scanning for threats, the radio crackling with static. Behind them, other tanks halted to avoid collision. In seconds, the Tiger's advantage, mobility and firepower, vanished. Through the periscope, the commander might see nothing but a stretch of frozen road and his own exhaust clouding backward. The battlefield, once dominated by his gun, was now ruled by silence. It's not fear of destruction that seizes a tank crew in those moments. It's helplessness. The knowledge that a single obstruction, unseen and invisible, has stripped their invincibility. In that frozen silence, the myth of the Tiger cracked, not from shells or fire, but from stillness. The story of a wire loop stopping a Tiger tank isn't only about physics, it's about the human, tactical and psychological dimensions of warfare. Because in every battle there's a moment when complexity meets simplicity, and simplicity wins. The leadership and logistics angle. When a giant breaks down for commanders, the Tiger was both pride and burden. It inspired fear in the enemy, and exhaustion in its own supply lines. Each machine required a full crew, a recovery unit, fuel convoys, and mechanics trained to manage a vehicle that could break down from its own design. In 1943 and 1944, German panzer divisions learned a painful truth. For every Tiger in combat, several sat immobilized behind the lines awaiting repair. Logistics reports noted that up to half of all Tiger losses on the Eastern Front were not from enemy fire, but mechanical failure, lack of parts, or terrain damage. A jammed sprocket, thrown track, or broken transmission could render an entire column useless. And recovery wasn't simple. Even with tow cables, few vehicles could move a Tiger. Recovery tanks like the Famo half-track often bogged down themselves, requiring hours, sometimes days, to free the heavy beasts. Leadership understood the symbolic value of the Tiger. Propaganda painted it as unstoppable. But on the ground, officers quietly dreaded its fragility. A single immobilization could stall an entire advance. That's why small acts of sabotage, even accidental, carried enormous strategic weight. A few meters of wire costing less than a bullet could waste gallons of fuel, days of labor, and the momentum of an entire operation. It was the perfect asymmetry. One soldier's improvisation against a nation's engineering marvel. Logistically, this defined the late-war German predicament. The Reich had built weapons that outperformed but outlasted their own resources. Each Tiger that failed wasn't just a loss of machinery. It was a symbol of the collapsing balance between ambition and sustainability. And that is where leadership faced its harshest truth. The stronger the weapon, the weaker the chain that supports it. The moral and psychological angle. The fall of invincibility. Every era of warfare carries a myth. In 1944, the myth was the Tiger. Stories spread through Allied trenches. That shells bounced off it. That it took 10 tanks to destroy one. That its gun could reach farther than anything else. For soldiers on the ground, the Tiger was less a machine and more a nightmare made real. But when news spread, or rumors whispered, that a single engineer had stopped one using only a coil of wire, something changed in the psychology of war. It wasn't just about tactics, it was about belief. If a simple act of ingenuity could cripple the most feared tank on Earth, then perhaps the myth was breakable too. The aura of invulnerability faded, replaced by something else. The understanding that human intellect could outwit brute force. German crews, too, felt this pressure. Their reputation was a double-edged sword. Every Tiger became a magnet for enemy fire and sabotage. Each mechanical issue felt like betrayal by their own machine. Fear shifted. Not from shells, but from failure. Wars are often remembered by machines. Spitfire, Sherman, Tiger, T-34. But they're won by adaptation. The wire loop symbolized that mindset. The capacity to turn environment into advantage, to use what was at hand against what seemed untouchable. It also represented a moral inversion. The Tiger was born of industrial might, the wire loop of human necessity. When that thin strand of steel met the tank's armor, it was more than metal meeting metal. It was the collision of two philosophies of war. And in that moment, the myth cracked because history doesn't always bend to the biggest weapon. It bends to the cleverest mind. From fear to mechanics, from leadership to psychology, every angle of this story reveals the same truth. The war of machines was always, secretly, a war of minds. The Tiger's downfall, whether by shell, mine, or wire, was not just an event. It was a lesson. Power can be engineered, but resilience must be improvised. The battlefield is about to prove that. The road to the trap. Winter, 1944. The morning began like so many others on the Eastern Front. Cold, colorless, and heavy with anticipation. A column of WWII tanks from the 502nd Heavy Panzer Battalion moved along a narrow road near the outskirts of Leningrad. The air was brittle, fog hanging low over the pines. Every few minutes the ground trembled as 57 tons of steel lurched forward. The lead tank, call sign 121, had survived Kursk, Narva, and countless artillery barrages. Its crew trusted it like an old friend, an invincible beast that could shrug off anything the Soviets threw. But beneath the armor, they knew its limits. The driver, Feldwebel Rolf Meissner, cursed the terrain every kilometer. The mud was frozen in patches, the snow half melted, the kind of ground that could swallow a tiger whole. Ahead, reconnaissance had cleared the route. But what no one saw, what no one could have expected, was that along a narrow bend in the forest road, a length of wire had been laid, drawn taut between two buried stakes, hidden under frost and snow. Not a mine, not an explosive, just tension and timing. On the other side of the road, concealed beneath broken brush, an engineer, identity long lost to history, crouched low. In Soviet records, there are mentions of mechanical entanglements used during the Leningrad counteroffensive. Perhaps he was one of them. Perhaps he acted on instinct. He held one end of the spool, his breath visible in short bursts. The sound of engines grew closer. He waited until the leading tank was nearly on the bend, then locked the wire to a second anchor and pulled it tight. The Tiger's massive tracks rolled forward. The leading edge of the right sprocket caught the wire, a barely perceptible snag, and in an instant the tension snapped tight. Steel screamed. The wire, drawn into the rotating teeth, tightened like a garrote. The full torque of the Maybach engine turned against itself. A loud crack. A pin sheared off. A jolt rippled through the drivetrain. Meissner slammed the clutch instinctively. The Tiger lurched, nose dipping, and stopped. From behind, the rest of the column halted abruptly, confused. Inside 121, the commander shouted over the intercom, "Drive, wider!" The driver tried to engage again, but the right track wouldn't move. The gauges spiked. A grinding sound echoed through the hull. Something was wrong. He tried reverse. The Tiger shuddered, then silence. The smell of burning oil filled the cabin. Seconds of stillness. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily. The fog swallowed the sound. The engineer stayed frozen in his position. He hadn't expected it to work, not really. But the tank had stopped. The impossible had happened. In those few seconds, he was a witness to a quiet miracle of mechanics. A weapon built by Germany's finest minds, brought to silence by a single strand of steel. Behind the first Tiger, the second attempted to maneuver around, but the road was too narrow. In trying to reverse, its tracks churned mud and ice, exposing it to the flanks. Soviet infantry, waiting in the tree line, saw their chance. A flare went up. Red. Mortars opened from the ridge. The frozen air erupted with thunder. The Tiger column, pinned on the narrow road, couldn't move forward or back. 121 became a shield. A 57-ton obstacle, blocking everything behind. The engineer ducked, covering his head as shrapnel ripped through the trees. For him, it was no longer about a clever trick or victory. It was survival. But for history, it was a moment that summed up an entire war. The collision of ingenuity and machinery, of intellect against overconfidence. Because in that frozen forest, power had met precision. And lost. The roar of engines faded. The battle moved on. When the smoke cleared, the Tiger remained. Track twisted, immobilized, its armor untouched but its motion stolen. It would later be towed, perhaps repaired, perhaps abandoned. The names of its crew were never recorded in that moment's aftermath. The engineer's name, too, vanished into anonymity. But the result lived on, whispered, retold, mythologized. A man with a wire had stopped a tank, and from that small victory, an idea would ripple through the ranks. If one could be stopped, so could others. The balance of fear had shifted. The moment after, when the monster stops breathing, when the Tiger's engine died, it wasn't silence. It was disbelief. Inside the steel hull, the crew felt a vibration run through the chassis, then nothing. The Maybach's rumble, once constant and commanding, faded to a hollow stillness. Only the hiss of steam from the exhaust broke the quiet. The commander, Oberleutnant Kruger, ordered the hatch open. Cold air flooded in, carrying the smell of oil and burned clutch. He and Meissner leaned out. Nothing looked destroyed. No shell impacts, no smoke. Just stillness. He motioned to the mechanic to check the drive sprocket. Crawling under the tank, the man found it. Twisted wire, coiled tight, jammed between teeth and track links. A few broken fragments glistened with frost and oil. It was absurd. Something so thin had stopped them cold. Kruger knew the danger. A stationary Tiger was a beacon. They had seconds before the Soviets zeroed in. He ordered smoke deployment, but it was too late. From the ridge came the low whistle of incoming rounds. Artillery landed short, showering them with dirt. The second Tiger reversed in panic, throwing mud high into the air. But the road was narrow and soft. Soon it too bogged down, its treads spinning futilely. The battlefield had turned against the machines. Within minutes, the engineer's single act had done what artillery often couldn't: halted a column of armor. Chain reaction. How one stop changes a battle. The immobilization of the lead tank created what military historians later called mechanical choke points. The Tigers behind it couldn't advance or pivot without risking the ditch. Supply trucks and half-tracks stacked up along the road. Communication broke down as engines idled, and visibility dropped. For the Soviets watching from the tree line, this was the cue. Infantry and sappers moved through the snow, launching smoke grenades to cover their advance. Anti-tank teams carried Molotovs and satchel charges, aiming not to destroy, but to disable more tracks, to turn the road into a scrapyard of immobilized giants. Within half an hour, the German column, once unstoppable, had become a corridor of confusion. Kruger's Tiger was hit by mortars, not penetrated but battered. The shock waves ruptured a suspension arm. One side sagged. He gave the evacuation order. The crew dismounted, taking cover behind their own tank. The same armor that had once made them untouchable now became their shield in retreat. The Soviets closed in cautiously. They didn't waste shells. They knew the Tiger's value. Every captured or abandoned one was a victory beyond numbers. Engineers would later study its mechanisms, its thick armor, its fragile drive assembly. They didn't need to destroy the legend. They only needed to understand where it failed. That day provided the lesson in real time. The mechanical autopsy in later German maintenance logs from the 502nd Battalion, several entries from that winter, mention immobilizations due to wire, entanglement in sprocket area, and track, derailment from foreign obstruction. Whether this precise event inspired those reports or mirrored them, the principle remained the same: small interference, catastrophic consequence. The sprocket jammed, torque transferred unevenly, and the massive power of the Maybach engine turned inward, breaking itself. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. Even in Normandy months later, Allied engineers used cables, mines, and heavy chains to trap advancing Panthers and Tigers in hedgerow country. Each time, the effect was the same: mechanical paralysis leading to tactical collapse. The Tiger's myth was dying not in fire, but in friction. The legacy of the moment. The engineer who set that trap never made the history books. No medals, no citations, but his act echoed through doctrine. Field manuals soon emphasized obstruction as a form of anti-tank warfare, the art of disruption through simplicity. In that, his wire loop became more than a trick. It was a philosophy. The war had entered an age where ingenuity equaled firepower. A soldier's creativity could shift the odds as much as any weapon factory. The story spread, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes dismissed. Some said it was a myth, a piece of trench folklore. But the core truth was undeniable. The tiger, the symbol of invulnerability, could be stopped by something as unassuming as wire. And that knowledge, that realization, traveled faster than any bullet. Because myths die not when they are disproven, but when they are understood. By the time the smoke cleared that day, the tiger column was gone, abandoned, captured, or retreating. The road was littered with frozen tracks, bent sprockets, and half-buried wire glinting in the snow. A few meters away, the engineer had vanished into the woods, leaving behind no name, no claim, only proof that ingenuity had teeth. The tank would be salvaged later, dragged back toward Narva for repair. But its story had already outlived its steel. The war was full of tanks that failed, and men who improvised. But on that frozen road, for a few defining minutes, the balance of power between machine and man tilted, not through fire, but through thought. The cost of immobility. When the fighting subsided along that narrow forest road, the silence that followed felt heavier than the battle itself. The tiger lay still, its armor untouched, its power undone. Around it, the snow was scarred with black oil and the outlines of boot prints leading away. In purely tactical terms, this incident would barely register in official reports. The Wehrmacht filed it as yet another mechanical immobilization under combat conditions. But in the broader rhythm of the war, moments like these were defining. By 1944, German armored divisions were bleeding momentum. The Tiger, once their spearhead, was increasingly an anchor, a weapon too valuable to risk, too fragile to maintain. A single immobilization like this could halt an entire column, forcing reorganization and exposing supply units. Every breakdown became a small strategic victory for the enemy. In the months that followed, more such reports accumulated. Track failure in thaw conditions. Wire. Obstruction in right sprocket. Mobility. Lost in narrow defile due to foreign object. Each line in those maintenance logs was a tiny obituary for German armor's myth of invulnerability. The numbers told the story better than any anecdote. By late 1944, mechanical and terrain-related losses accounted for almost half of all Tiger WWII write-offs. Fewer than 1,400 were ever built, and of those, only a fraction reached battle in working condition at any given time. To the German command, the lesson came too late. To the engineers on the ground, it was already obvious. No weapon, however mighty, can survive when its own complexity outpaces the reality of the battlefield. The Allied and Soviet view on the other side. Allied and Soviet engineers studied captured Tigers with scientific curiosity. They admired the precision of its gearbox, the smoothness of its 88mm gun traverse, the strength of its frontal armor. But what fascinated them most was its weakness. In British and Soviet technical reports, entire sections were devoted to mechanical vulnerabilities. Among them were the exposed sprocket teeth, the interleaved wheels prone to clogging, and the fragile torsion bars under excessive load. The Tiger's own perfection had made it brittle. Soviet manuals instructed sappers to exploit those weak points. They were told to aim for the tracks, the drive sprockets, or any obstruction likely to jam rotation. It wasn't just theory, it was practiced. Field exercises tested cables, logs, and wire snaring under tension. The principle was simple. A tank that can't move is already half defeated. To Allied propaganda, stories of stopped Tigers became morale weapons. Newspapers printed lines like, "German monster tanks crippled by courage and ingenuity." The message was clear. Brains could beat brawn. Soldiers needed to believe that even the enemy's best machines could be neutralized by cleverness, not just by firepower. In Moscow, these tales fed into a larger narrative of resilience, the ingenuity of the common soldier against overwhelming odds. Whether the wire loop case was a specific incident or an amalgamation of many, it fit the moral truth of the Eastern Front, that human resourcefulness was the ultimate equalizer. The quiet consequence. For the crews who survived, the memory lingered differently. Tankers feared not the enemy they could see, but the terrain that could betray them, the ditch that deepened, the wire they couldn't spot, the track that froze solid overnight. German training shifted subtly in the winter of 1944-45. Crews were instructed to inspect roadsides for possible entanglements, to avoid narrow paths without infantry screens, to keep constant motion when advancing through forests. But the war was already slipping away from precision and control. No amount of caution could offset dwindling fuel, spare parts, or time. The wire in that forest road had become a metaphor, thin, invisible, and unstoppable. It represented how small acts, multiplied across thousands of encounters, could erode an empire's momentum. The Tiger's downfall wasn't a single defeat. It was a slow, grinding surrender to the laws of physics and human ingenuity. The broader collapse of the Tiger myth. By the beginning of 1945, the legend of the Tiger tank had shifted from awe to irony. What was once a symbol of German dominance had become a reminder of its excess, an over-engineered monument to a strategy out of step with reality. On both the Eastern and Western fronts, advancing Allied forces encountered more abandoned Tigers than destroyed ones. Photographs from the ruins of Poland, France, and Prussia show these giants tilted in ditches, tracks thrown, hatches open, their interiors stripped for parts. The invincible machines of 1942 had become immovable relics of a dying empire. Each immobilized Tiger told the same story, that the war of ideas had overtaken the war of machines. Germany's technical brilliance, once unmatched, had outpaced its logistical capacity. The wire, the mud, the cold, those were the true victors. Historians would later note that even Hitler himself became obsessed with super-heavy tank projects like the Maus and E-100, chasing the illusion of invulnerability while his armies starved for trucks, fuel, and reliable equipment. The same mindset that built the Tiger, the pursuit of perfection, had ensured defeat. In post-war analyses, the Tiger's vulnerabilities became textbook lessons. Military academies from Sandhurst to Frunze taught that engineering should serve battlefield realities, not defy them. Power without practicality is a flaw disguised as strength, and so, the Tiger's legacy split in two, admired by engineers, but pitied by historians. The engineer's legacy. No one knows the name of the man who laid that wire. His act was too small for records, too humble for medals. Yet his method, or others like it, would ripple through military thinking for decades. In the years after the war, when armies rebuilt their doctrines, they placed new emphasis on mobility warfare, the understanding that movement, not armor, decides survival. Engineers began developing tools to disable, not destroy, caltrops for vehicles, spike mats, entangling devices, and later in the Cold War, track-disrupting chains and cables for light armor. What began as desperation in the snow evolved into design. The wire loop story became a parable in engineering. Schools and field manuals, sometimes cited, sometimes doubted, but always respected for what it represented. The triumph of human problem-solving over blind power. In its quiet way, it foreshadowed an entire philosophy of asymmetric warfare, that in any era, the side with fewer resources could still win through creativity, by finding the flaw in the machine. Because that's what the anonymous engineer had done. Not destroy a tank, but dismantle a myth, what remained. After when the war ended, many Tigers were scrapped, melted down, or shipped to Allied proving grounds. A few survived, like the one now preserved in Bovington, England, each scar and dent telling its own mechanical story. Visitors who stand beside one today often marvel at its size, its thickness, its aura of menace. But what history remembers is not its power. It's how fragile that power proved to be. That fragility wasn't just metal. It was ideology. It was the belief that domination could be engineered, that fear could be mass-produced. The wire in the snow said otherwise. It said that no matter how mighty a machine becomes, it is still vulnerable to the mind that understands it. In the end, that's how the tiger fell, not with a blaze of artillery, but with a whisper of steel pulled tight across a road, by hands steady enough to wait. A single loop of wire had become a symbol for every soldier who ever faced the impossible, and found a way. The war ended, but the lessons didn't. In museums and documentaries, the tiger still looms like a monument to industrial ambition, vast, terrifying, and beautiful in its precision. Yet its truest story isn't about what it destroyed. It's about how easily it could be stopped. In the frozen quiet of 1944, a nameless engineer taught the world something profound: that strength built only on material power is temporary. Real strength lies in adaptability, in the human mind that sees not just obstacles, but opportunities hidden inside them. The wire loop that jammed a tiger's track wasn't a miracle. It was logic under fire. It was knowledge applied under fear, the rarest form of courage. That single moment of resistance, whether documented or lost to rumor, stands as a metaphor for every instance when ingenuity overcame intimidation. History often remembers the grand, the generals, the machines, the victories carved into stone. But the quiet victories, the ones born from desperation and wit, are the ones that endure, because they remind us that wars are not only fought with guns and armor, but with intellect, patience, and nerve. The Tiger tank represented the height of mechanical confidence. The wire loop represented the simplicity that humbles it. Between them lies the eternal equation of warfare, that no weapon is invincible, and no problem beyond the reach of human thought. So when the great engines of war finally fell silent, it wasn't just the end of conflict, it was a reckoning, a realization that ingenuity will always be the sharpest weapon on the battlefield. And somewhere in history's frozen forests, beneath the snow and the rust, a single strand of steel still waits, quiet proof that even the mightiest machines can be undone by a human hand steady enough to hold the line. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that human ingenuity can outmatch even the strongest machines, then don't let it fade into silence. Support historical storytelling, like, share, and subscribe to keep real wartime engineering stories alive. The ones buried under rust and time, waiting to be rediscovered. Comment below. What other forgotten WWII inventions or battlefield hacks should we uncover next? Your ideas shape the next episode.